Hey everybody, Pete Pardo from Sea of Tranquility. Got a new type of show for you here today. You know, we've been doing these artist retrospectives, we've been doing the rants, we've been doing the new product reviews, all this kind of great new stuff that we're bringing to the YouTube channel. So we had a couple of you out there who asked if we could do some sort of kind of like best of genre type of shows, right? So what I figured I'd do to kind of kickstart this all off is I went back to a decade that's pretty near and dear to my heart, the 1970s, and I figure, why don't we do a show talking about some of my favorite albums of the early hard rock and heavy metal era, specifically the 70s. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let me just start off by telling you, I'm only going to do one band's albums, I should say. So you're not going to see any band show up more than once in this for this 10-year period. You're also not going to see any live albums here. So this is strictly studio releases. So you're only going to see one release from bands like Purple, Sabbath, Zeppelin, Priest, so on and so forth. Because I could have easily picked 3 or 4 or 5 albums from just like a handful of artists and had that take up the whole show. And we didn't want to do that because I wanted to give some coverage to some bands that might not necessarily appear on a kind of list like this. I also, for this particular show, I also picked bands who are fairly well known, who were signed to, major labels, pretty notable acts, right? But there's a whole host of other ones. I think I'm going to do a part 2 of this. There's a whole host of other bands, like more underground, unknown bands who kind of toiled down below the surface, but were pretty damn good and released some killer albums in the 1970s. So I'm going to do that for a second show. It's going to be kind of like the best hard rock and metal act, underground hard rock and metal acts of the 70s. But right now, these are going to be more of the kind of mainstream bands that you know. So we're going to start off, again, we're going 1970 to 1979. We're going to kind of do these in somewhat chronological order here for the most part. I'm not going to bother mentioning years, but just figure they're going to start at 1970 and work their way through the end of the decade. So the first one I'm going to talk about, one of my favorite albums of all time, my favorite band of all time. This one just made the cut, right? Just released in 1970. I think Machine Head gets all the credit when they talk about this band in their most important albums. But I think that this album is leagues heavier. It's just got some great material on it, and the songs are not as kind of played out as some of the tunes on Machine Head. I'm talking about In Rock from Deep Purple, of course. Child in Time, Black Knight, Speed King, Flight of the Rat, Into the Fire. Great tunes. Heavy Ritchie Blackmore guitar riffs. First studio album with Ian Gillan, Screaming Up a Storm. John Lord's keyboards and Hammond organ. Okay. Roger Glover, Ian Pace. It's thunderous. It's heavy rock. When they talk about the birth of kind of hard rock and heavy metal, basically started with Zeppelin, Purple, Sabbath, Uriah Heep, for the most part, right? And without this album, none of this stuff would ever happen. This album is way heavier than Zeppelin's album, in my opinion. Not quite as lumbering as Sabbath's album, but man, this is probably as heavy as Deep Purple ever got. A seminal album. Okay, a band that I think deserves to be mentioned up there with those 4 I just mentioned, because these guys were doing pretty heavy stuff at the same time as well. So we're talking about the pre-Woodstock generation. So I'm talking about New York's Mountain, Leslie West and Company. This is Climbing. Okay, probably their most famous album. They had a handful of really good releases in the late 60s, early 70s. This is their second album. Technically their first album. Leslie West had a solo album called Leslie West Mountain. Basically it was Mountain, but this is technically the debut of Mountain. And on here, we've got Mississippi Queen, theme from Imaginary Western, Never in My Life, Silver Paper, For Yasgur's Farm, To My Friend, The Laird, Sitting on a Rainbow, killer tune, and Boys in the Band. Just killer Gibson riffs from Leslie. And stinging solos. I mean, there's a reason why Michael Schenker lists him as his main guitar hero. Just a great heavy rock album, and again, sowing the seeds of what we would know to become metal much later on. Okay, next up, another band that doesn't get mentioned often enough, and I think they did some really great work in the very early 70s, and all 3 members went on to, a lot of acclaim in other bands, but it was with this band that everything kind of started. I'm talking about Trapeze. The album is Medusa. Let's pull it up there, get the glare out. Okay, so you got Glenn Hughes on bass and vocals, Mel Galley on guitar and vocals, Dave Holland on drums. We all know the sad story of Dave Holland in recent years. He just passed away, not recently, but of course went on to greater fame in Judas Priest. Mel Galley wound up joining Whitesnake after kind of staying in Trapeze for most of the 70s. And Glenn Hughes, obviously we know, went on to Deep Purple, worked with Hughes and Thrall, Black Sabbath, solo career, Black Country Communion. He's done a lot of work over the years. But this album, it's heavy. Great riffs on here from Mel Galley. A lot of really good guitar work. Killer vocals from a very, very young Glenn Hughes. He was basically a teenager when this album was put out. Black Cloud, Jury, Your Love Is All Right, Touch My Life, Seafull, Makes You Want to Cry, and the classic title track, Medusa. Heavy album, but lots of groove, plenty of funk. Really, really underrated band. If you've never checked out Trapeze, I highly recommend that album and the one that comes after it. Okay. Uriah Heep, mentioned them before. Again, a mainstay of the heavy rock scene in the early, mid-70s. You might be thinking I'm going to talk about Demons and Wizards, right? If you watched my retrospective of the history of Uriah Heep recently, you'll know that my favorite album by the Heapsters is Look at Yourself. Okay? Because from top to bottom, it's just killer, right? Look at Yourself, I Want to Be Free, July Morning, Tears in My Eyes, Shadows of Grief, What Should Be Done, and Love Machine. Doesn't get much better than that. Heavy rock, blues rock, psych, prog, and boogie. It's everything all mixed into one. You just can't beat this album. So one thing that I want to make sure you guys understand right now is, like, I am not going to pick like the typical albums that everybody would expect me to pick. I'm going to pick, and those are great albums, because we all know what, kind of what those most popular albums by all these bands are. But they may not necessarily be my favorites, okay, of the bunch. But these are essential albums in my view. So again, Demons and Wizards, great album. Might be my second favorite Heap album of all time, but I always kind of lean towards this one. All right, a band who was called from the beginning the Americas Led Zeppelin. Okay, I never really understood it. If you listen to the music of Cactus, they don't really sound like Zeppelin to me. Their third album is my favorite, one way or another. I know their debut gets all the hoopla, but I like this one the best. These guys were basically just a kick-ass American blues and boogie and hard rock band. They didn't pretend to be anything else. Carmine Appice on drums. Jim McCarty on ripping guitar. Tim Bogert on bass. Okay, Rusty Day on vocals. You got Long Tall Sally on here. Rock Out Whatever You Feel Like. Rock and Roll Children. Big Mama Boogie. Feel So Bad. Song for Aries. Hometown Bust. And of course the classic One Way or Another. One of the best songs you've probably never heard before. Rippin', bluesy heavy rock. Killer stuff. Cactus. Great, great band. All right, so here's an album by a band that I love to death. This is probably one of my favorite albums by them. It wasn't actually the album I was going to pick for this show, but the album I was going to pick, I went and looked at the dates. I wanted to make sure I had everything accurate in the 70s, and the one I was going to pick, which is their second album, was released in late 1969. Did not make the cut. Had to find the next best one, right? So, of course, I went to, again, one of my other favorites, but it definitely ranks up there because it's a hard rocking album. It's got a ton of groove, a lot of funk, okay? You may have an idea who I'm talking about. Grand Funk Railroad, E Pluribus Funk. Let's see if we can see that. There we go. Kind of got the coin on the front. Foot Stomping Music, People Let's Stop the War, Upsetter, I Come Tumbling. What a great tune that is. Save the Land, another heavy rock tune. No Lies, and the classic epic Loneliness. A moody epic kind of along the same lines as I'm Your Captain. Maybe not quite as catchy. The Funksters were a great, great, great trio at the time. Mark Farner and company, just a very, very, they're a huge band at the time. But they don't get enough talk these days when people are discussing like the great heavy bands of the early 70s. They were definitely one of them. Okay, here's something you may not have expected here from a band, Dutch band, who got a lot of notoriety for a couple hit singles later in their career. Radar Love, Twilight Zone. Of course, I'm talking about Golden Earring. This is one of their early albums called Seven Tears. They were pretty heavy back in their early days. I'm telling you. Go inspect, stay away from maybe the first 2, maybe 3 albums. First 2 albums of Golden Earring, which are good, but they're more in like the psych pop realm. But then their next like 3, 4 albums, really good early mid-70s heavy rock. Really good. A lot of good heavy guitars. Really good vocals. You know, Silver Ships, Don't Worry, and especially She Flies on Strange Wings. Go to YouTube, look that up. She Flies on Strange Wings. Great, great early heavy rock song. Golden Earring. Underrated band. All right, you knew I was going to get to these guys eventually, but again, we're trying to go in chronological order here. So I'm talking about Birmingham's best, Black Sabbath, one of my favorite bands of all time. Them and Purple are just have always ranked up there for me. And you might think that I'm going to talk about, maybe Paranoid. Can't talk about the debut because that's pre-19. Well, it's right about 1970. Well, I think that's technically 69. Master of Reality, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, all fantastic albums. I love them to death. But since I was a wee kid, maybe this high, my favorite album from the Ozzy era of Sabbath was always Volume 4. And there's reasons why. When you've got Wheels of Confusion, Tomorrow's Dream, Supernaut, Snowblind, and Under the Sun, early metal, doom, hard rock, whatever the fuck you want to call it, doesn't get much better than that, folks. What I love about this album is that while a lot of it is, heavy and lumbering and just riff-driven, a lot of variety here, a lot of textures, all right, a lot of different melodies, and there's a couple mellower tunes, a couple instrumentals mixed in there. This album's kind of has it all for me. It's got really cool production, very different. It's very airy, okay, atmospheric. So the band was just starting to experiment a little bit. They would move on to some proggy things over the next couple albums, but here's kind of where that little shift began. And I just love this album. There's just some tunes on here that are forever my favorite Sabbath songs. So, Volume 4. All right, something kind of a little different here. May not be heavy enough for some of you, but I always thought this band was pretty damn rocking. Talking about Humble Pie, Smokin'. This is the first album after Peter Frampton left and Clem Clemson joins up, fresh from Coliseum. Of course, this is just a great band that combine, like hard rock, soul, funk, and blues rock. And you got Hot and Nasty, Come On Everybody, all sorts of great tunes on here. Steve Marriott, one of the greatest singers of any genre ever. Probably one of the best singers of the 70s without a doubt. And this album just further cemented how much of a great singer he really was. But the album really rocks pretty damn hard. Okay, I had to fit this band in somewhere, somehow. They have a lot of great albums in the 70s. Some kind of heavy, rockin', others a little more mixing prog and all sorts of different things. Definitely pop. But their debut album was a real kick in the ass and pretty heavy. You still listen to this album today and think, man, that's a pretty heavy album for the time. Talking about the debut from Queen. I mean, it's got some heavy stuff on here. Keep Yourself Alive, Great King Rat, My Fairy King, Liar, and of course, Son and Daughter. Blistering tune. There's a reason why Corrosion of Conformity covered that song on their latest album, right? It's a damn heavy song. Modern Times Rock and Roll, Jesus, Seven Seas Ride, yeah. Crushing Brian May guitar work, Freddie Mercury, amazing vocals, a great album. I almost picked their second album, Queen 2, which I like quite a bit. This one's a bit heavier, I think, and deserves mention on this show. Okay, Led Zeppelin, got to have them on the show, right? I could have picked any of their albums. First Instinct is to always grab, the fourth album. As great as it is, I started looking elsewhere. First album, can't do, that's 69. The second album is great. I like the fourth album better. Zeppelin 3, I've really grown to like over the years. But again, it's half like kind of acoustic folky stuff. The other half, a mix of hard rockers and blues. As much as I love it, I felt maybe not right for this show. But I always go back to this album. And it was their double album, comprised of songs that are heavy, some bluesy tunes, a couple like real atmospheric kind of poppy things, all sorts of stuff on here. But it's a triumph, okay? Physical Graffiti, Trampled Underfoot, Kashmir, The Rover, Wonton Song, In My Time of Dying. I mean, one classic after another on here. Doesn't get much better. This is like epic Zeppelin at their best. even though it may have been at the time a collection of new tunes and leftovers and whatnot, it was a success. Okay, this band, again, another one of the best debuts of all time. Probably the best album that Ronnie Montrose or Sammy Hagar ever appeared on. Might be arguable there, but I think it's a drop-dead stone cold classic. Of course, I'm talking about the self-titled debut from the band Montrose. Sammy's vocals are off the charts great here. Ronnie Montrose's guitar work is crisp, heavy, but simple. In fact, that's what I like about this album. It's amazing in its simplicity. These are just great heavy rock tunes with killer hooks, just killer guitar riffs. The rhythms are tight, you know. Space Station Number 9, Rock Candy. It's just so many great tunes on here. You know, so many great tunes on here. It just, what else? Rock the Nation. Drop Dead, start to finish. Classic, classic, classic album. Never gets old. Okay, this was another hard one here. Talking about the Alice Cooper group, right? The initial Alice Cooper group. There's like a handful of albums that they released. Let's discount their first two, which are kind of psychedelic. Maybe you don't quite fit into what we're talking about. But, you know, Love It to Death, Killer, and School's Out. You know all those albums, right? And the one I actually wound up picking, which in the end I just couldn't not pick this album, is $1 Billion Babies. Top to bottom, great tunes. It's heavy, it's poppy, it's kind of weird, it's kind of ghoulish, you know. I just so many great tunes on here. It's got to be on the show. Got to include one of those albums, right? Might as well be that one. Okay, kind of keeping the same theme as what we just did there, kind of that, you know, a little coming more from the theatrical end of things. Got to have Kiss in this discussion, right? A lot of Kiss to choose from, but since we're not picking any live albums, I couldn't pick Kiss Alive, which would have been the obvious choice and my favorite Kiss album of all time. My second gut instinct was to pick the first album because it's got the best songs on it. But to be honest, I always liked the way those songs sounded better on the live album. And I think the production is somewhat weak on that first album. So I didn't pick that one. Destroyer is great for what it is. Maybe not as heavy through and through, you know. I think it's half of Destroyer is amazing. The other half of it is really good. Love Gun, again, half really good. The other half, pretty good. Rock and Roll Over is a really good album. Dress to Kill is a really good album. What do we got left, right? So, of course, my favorite album, again, of the studio albums, and probably not by much over some of the ones I just talked about, but just because I've really appreciated a lot more in recent years, is Hotter Than Hell. I just think it's a really strong album, and just some great tunes on here that have stood the test of time. So, you know, you got to choose. And a lot of these appeared on the live album, but they're still really good on this album. I think the way these songs sound on this studio album are fairly similar to how good they sound on the live album. As opposed to the first album, I think some of those tunes from the first album definitely sounded better live. But these, I think, hold up pretty well on here. So Got to Choose and Parasite, great on here. Going Blind is a great tune, underrated tune, I think. Hotter Than Hell, the title track, kick-ass. Let Me Go, Rock and Roll, not one of my favorites here. All the Way, another really good song, I think. Watching You, one of my favorite all-time Kiss songs. Mainline, kind of dig that tune, you know, Peter Criss singing that one. Coming Home, and Strange Ways, written by Ace Frehley. But it's just a really underrated tune and heavy, I think. So I find this album pretty heavy, very enjoyable still. It's kind of dark, and just it's got this vibe that I always really liked. So Hotter Than Hell. All right, we're going to stay with the New Yorkers here, and one of my all-time favorite bands from Long Island. Talking about Blue Oyster Cult, Secret Treaties. A lot of tunes, a lot of albums you could have picked from Blue Oyster Cult. I was tempted by the one before it, tempted by the one after it, tempted by a lot of them actually. But you know, when it comes down to it, for me, this is their strongest album, top to bottom, out of all the 70s albums. And you know, when you've got Career of Evil, Subhuman, Dominance and Submission, ME262, KG Cretans, Harvester of Eyes, Flaming Telepaths, and of course, Astronomy. How can you go wrong there? How can you pick any other Blue Oyster Cult album? It's heavy, it's thought-provoking, it's melodic, it's kind of psychedelic a little bit, because Blue Oyster Cult kind of always had that psych edge to their music. Killer guitar work, great vocals, a lot of variety, just a classic. All right, so here's a band I was tempted to include in part 2 of this show of more of the underground stuff, but they were signed to a major label. They were a pretty well-known band at the time, but for the most part, they're one of those bands that kind of like casual listeners of this style of music who maybe have heard of a lot of these bands may not be familiar with these guys, other than the fact that Metallica covered a bunch of their tunes on some cover albums in the 80s, right? Of course, I'm talking about Budgie. Just one of the unsung heavy bands of the 70s. As heavy as Black Sabbath. I'm telling you. Riffs as heavy as Tony Iommi's, with lead vocals that sound a little bit like Geddy Lee from Rush. Sound like a cool combination? A great band. They had a lot of really good albums, but this one has always been my favorite. It's Budgie's In for the Kill. Some great tunes on there. The title track is incredible. Crash Course and Brain Surgery. Metallica covered that tune. Oh, what else we have here? Zoom Club, great song. Hammer and Tongs, Running from My Soul, Living on Your Own. Just a great, great heavy album. If you've never listened to Budgie before, I urge you to. Go out and check out any of their 70s albums, especially like the first 5 or 6. Incredible. Incredible stuff. All right, had to include this band because I love them. You may not think they belong here, but you know what? They were a pretty heavy band at the time. Talking about Canada's, we have to start getting some Canada bands on here, right? Because Rush is coming up, but I couldn't just have it be Rush here. Bachman Turner Overdrive, or BTO, whatever you want to call them. I'm talking about Four-Wheel Drive, because of course it had Not Fragile, Rock Is My Life, and This Is My Song, Roll Down the Highway, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet, blah, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet. I'm going to start stuttering like he did on there. Freewheeling, Sledgehammer, doesn't get any heavier than Sledgehammer. Blue Moanin', Secondhand, Giving It All Away. No nonsense, nothing complicated about these guys, but just good, heavy rock and roll music. I dig it. All right, an American guy who originally started out in the Amboy Dukes doing some psychedelic rockin' stuff. Of course, I'm talking about Ted Nugent. I always go back to his debut. That's probably my favorite of his because it's got, Stranglehold and Stormtrooper and Just What the Doctor Ordered and all sorts of other stuff, Motor City Madhouse. It's just a great, great hard rock album. At the time, we were kind of calling it metal, but, now you look back on it now, most of Nugent's stuff isn't that hard rock thing. But he had the metal attitude, right? I mean, there's not, just you look back on the 70s and you look at Ted. I mean, he was just screaming he was metal. Compared to today's metal, maybe not, but guy's still going strong today. Released a lot of really good albums. You could have picked Cat Scratch Fever or Free for All or any number of the other albums, but I always like the debut the best. Great guitar work on there, by the way. Another band I had to get into this show. They've had so many great tunes, so many heavy tunes. The main problem with these guys is that a lot of their albums have moments of greatness, but they're not very consistent. A lot of really strong albums, but there's none of their albums I would say are like killer top to bottom. This one's probably the closest. But they have other really good ones. I had a hard time picking one, but this one is really their strongest top to bottom. I'm talking about Nazareth, Hair of the Dog. Obviously, it's got to be this one. This is by far their strongest album, although they've got other really good ones. But, title track, Hair of the Dog, great heavy tune. Miss Misery, probably the heaviest tune they ever did in a true metal song. What else we got here? Guilty, Changing Times, Beggar's Day, Whiskey Drinking Woman, really good heavy blues rock tune. And, of course, Please Don't Judas Me, really atmospheric heavy tune. And a bonus track, of course, Love Hurts was the ballad they released as a single. Great album, Scottish band. Again, another group that doesn't get their due, I think. All right, so we're going to go back to America here. Got to have this band too. A couple albums you could put on here. This, I think, is always universally acclaimed as their best of the 70s, probably their heaviest album too. It's Rocks. When you got Back in the Saddle, Last Child, Rats in the Cellar, Sick as a Dog, Nobody's Fault, Get the Let Out, Licking a Promise, Home Tonight, Combination. Hard to argue. Toys in the Attic, probably a really close second. Draw the Line's pretty good too. They got a lot of good albums from the 70s, but this is probably their best and their heaviest. All right, so this one here, easily in my top 3 favorite albums of everything we're going to talk about here, and just a classic of the genre. I would say this as well as stuff from Rush and maybe a couple of the Priest albums, probably the birth of progressive metal. You might include Uriah Heep in that a little bit, but I definitely think this band kind of got the whole progressive metal thing started way before it actually became a thing, right? I'm talking about Rainbow Rising, their sophomore release. One of those albums that I play to this day and never fails to get me. I get all emotional when I hear this album, mainly because of the death of Ronnie James Dio a bunch of years ago. I think this is Dio's greatest performance ever on this album. Top to bottom, killer songs. Tarot Woman, Run with the Wolf, Starstruck, Do You Close Your Eyes, the epic Stargazer, one of the best songs ever. Okay, if you're a metal fan, you know that to be true. And Light in the Black, those two epics that end the album are just phenomenal. Ritchie Blackmore, Cozy Powell, Ronnie James Dio, Jimmy Bain, and Tony Carey. The best lineup of Rainbow ever. One of the best hard rock or metal lineups of any band ever. Unfortunately, they only stayed together for this one studio album and a live album. But it's a classic album nonetheless, one that still gets me every time right here. It's a very, very important album to me, and it deserves to be on here, obviously. All right, another band that I had a couple tough choices to make. This is probably the obvious choice. I almost went another direction, but I think we're talking about the best hard rock and metal albums. I think this is their most consistent album, top to bottom. Johnny the Fox is great. Fighting is great. Black Rose is great. Okay, got a bunch of really good albums. Bad Reputation is great, but when it came down to it, I had all of them in my hand, and I'm like, which one should I pick? Because some days this is my favorite, some days this is my favorite. But when it comes down to it, if I'm going to recommend an album, to you guys from this band, I know this one's kind of the obvious one, but it's also the best one, Jailbreak. Because, folks, when you got Jailbreak, Angel from the Coast, Warriors, Fight or Fall, Cowboy Song, Emerald, and of course, The Boys Are Back in Town, not even the best song in this album, but it's their biggest hit ever. You got to pick this one. Like I said, I almost went another direction. I love Johnny the Fox. It's not quite as heavy as this album. And this, Thin Lizzy's got to be on here somewhere. Might as well be that one. All right. One of the best debut albums of all time. Still holds up to this day, and I know for many of you, you probably heard most of these songs on FM radio ad nauseum over the years, myself included, but I think this is one of those albums that I've heard to death and I still can listen to and enjoy for the most part, because every song is just perfection. The guitars are perfect. They're killer. The vocals are fantastic. The songs are great. The hooks are great. It's just one anthem after another. Production's killer. Did I say that already? I don't know. I'm talking about Boston's debut. More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, Foreplay, Long Time, Rock and Roll Band, Smokin', Hitch a Ride, Something About You, and Let Me Take You Home Tonight. You know them all very well. They're still great, folks. It's a damn rockin' album. It may not be metal. Hard rock, it certainly is. Again, sold millions and millions and millions of copies. Everybody knows front to back, top to bottom. It's got to be on this show. You're probably thinking, okay, we're getting through the 70s. We're getting late on there. What are we at, 76? And we haven't talked about AC/DC yet. Well, we're getting ready to right now. Because, again, another one of those bands that had a lot of really good releases in the decade. Which one am I going to pick, right? I had this one in my hand, this one. I was like, I always seem to come back to Let There Be Rock. Because, when you got Go Down, Dog Eat Dog, Let There Be Rock, Bad Boy Boogie, Problem Child, come on, Overdose, Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be, of course it's not, and Whole Lot of Fucking Rosie, Angus and the Boys killed it on here. This was kind of the start of that skyrocketing trajectory that they really never fell off of. A great album. Almost all their albums are great, but this is one of my favorites from the 70s from them. All right, another band that had a few choices, some hard choices I had to make. So I love this era of the band. I'm talking about Germany's The Scorpions. And Virgin Killer and In Trance are really close to me. Really close to me. Those are the first two I ever got into. Actually, that's not true. Blackout was the first album I ever got from them. But I immediately went out and sought some of the earlier albums, and I fell deeply in love with the Uli John Roth era. And it was not till years later that I actually got a hold of the Taken by Force album. I would say probably like 5 or 8 years after that. Well, maybe not quite that long, but a few years after that, I got Taken by Force. And that's probably their heaviest out of the three. Really great. Again, it's pick 'em between those three albums, in my opinion. Fly to the Rainbow is good too, but I think Virgin Killers, In Trance, and Taken by Force. You know, it's got Steam Rock Fever, We'll Burn the Sky, I've Got to Be Free, Ride of Your Time, Sails of Sharon, come on. You're Light, He's a Woman, She's a Man, Born to Touch Your Feelings. This is great. Just heavy. Just ahead of its time music. The Uli John Roth era Scorpion stuff was ahead of its time. This was his last studio album with the band, you know, the Tokyo Tapes live album, which would have been on this list if I included live albums. Mandatory, he leaves after that. And in comes Matthias Jabs, as well as Michael Schenker back in for a little bit. And, you know, they kind of changed a little bit, but still released a lot of great material. But it's the 70s stuff for me that really still resonates. All right, speaking of Mr. Michael Schenker, got to have UFO on this list, correct? That's right. This is my favorite album of theirs from the 70s. Lights Out, I think, gets a little bit more acclaim. Phenomenon actually is, you know, for a lot of people, they're like, oh, that's kind of like the genesis of the classic UFO lineup. I get all that, but I think their heaviest album, most rockin' album, is Obsession, which was the last studio album with Mr. Schenker before he split. He would eventually come back again years later, but that's a story for another day. I think this one is just their most energetic and heavy album with some of Schenker's best lead guitar work out of any of the albums. Only You Can Rock Me, Pack It Up and Go. Best album they ever did. I mean, best song they ever did, in my opinion. I love Pack It Up and Go. Ain't No Baby, Looking Out for Number One, Hot and Ready. Great heavy stuff. Cherry, You Don't Fool Me. Another great heavy tune. Looking Out for Number One, Reprise. One More for the Rodeo. Great bluesy heavy rock tune. Born to Lose. Love it. Great album. All right, we mentioned Rush a little while ago, right? Got to get back to them. Again, another one of those bands I think I was tempted to choose Farewell to Kings because it might be my favorite of them, but it's a little more of a proggy album, I think. I think 2112 is too easy of a choice. I don't think it's... I love the album, but I think there's stronger albums. I was kind of tempted to grab one of the early albums, you know, like Fly By Night or Caress of Steel, which are great and really, really heavy. Proggy too. But, you know, when it comes down to it, I wanted to pick the album that for me is just like... It's just a mixture of all that was great about 70s Rush. It was heavy. It was complex and progressive. It was very artsy, right? Of course, I'm talking about Hemispheres. It's got to be Hemispheres, guys, right? Cygnus X1, Hemispheres, Circumstances, The Trees, and of course, one of the greatest heavy rock metal prog instrumentals of all time, La Villa Strangiato. This is, you know, one of those albums where Rush just showed how virtuoso they could be, and indeed they were. You weren't hearing playing like this with a lot of other bands at the time. This was pretty intense stuff, so it's got to be on this. Got to be on this list, as well as this next band. Again, I could have picked any number of albums. Sin After Sin, Hellbent for Leather, right? Stained Class for me. This, for me, is my favorite Priest album of all time. Probably among all this stuff, well, it's debatable, but probably the one true metal album that we know metal of is today. This is, I mean, these guys, you know, you can say that Sabbath started it all. Absolutely true, I think. You know, let's separate metal from hard rock here for a minute. Sabbath are the ones who really started heavy metal, I believe, into what we know it as today. But I think that these guys took that framework to the next level. Okay, Judas Priest, really, they turned this kind of like bluesy, hard rock thing, what all of a sudden got very riffy and took it into the stratosphere. Halford's vocals, nobody sang like that, you know? I mean, we had Ian Gillan, but I think Halford just was a totally different beast. You had the crazy twin guitar mayhem from K.K. Downing and Glenn Tipton, and great songs like Exciter. I mean, that's like basically like the birth of thrash or speed metal. White Heat, Red Hot, Better By You, Better Than Me, a great cover tune from an old Spooky Tunes classic. Stay in Class, a title track, Invader, Saints in Hell, doesn't get much better than that tune. Savage, Beyond the Realms of Death, Hero's End. I mean, come on. This is a classic. my favorite Priest album of all time. But again, one of many really good ones. I mean, basically every 70s album they put out was fantastic. So you could have picked any of them, but that's mine. All right, here's a band. We're winding down here. The last couple. Here's a band that you might not have expected to be in this list, but I love them. They're one of the better of the Deep Purple offshoot bands. Talking about Gillan Mr Universe. Might be a lot of folks listening to this or watching this who've never listened to this album or heard this album or heard the band. Go out and investigate Gillan's work here. Great band. Bernie Torme on guitar. All right, John McCoy on bass. Classic stuff. Ian Shrieking Up a Storm. Good heavy rock tunes. Very underrated band and a great album. Go onto YouTube. Once we're done with this show, go onto YouTube. Search Gillan Mr Universe. Either listen to the whole album or better yet, just go listen to the track Mr Universe. It's going to surprise you. It's heavy. It's a pretty crazy tune. Really, really good. Underrated band. All right, the final two. Got to have this band on here. They kind of emerged in the late 70s. Most people would say, oh, but of course it's got to be their debut, right? And I'm going to say, well, it could be, but I kind of like their second album a little better, I think. But either one is good. Talking about VH2. You're No Good, Dance the Night Away, Somebody Get Me a Doctor. For that one alone, right? Bottoms Up, another great tune. Out of Love Again. Just screaming Eddie guitar work. Light Up the Sky. Spanish Fly, DOA, Woman in Love, and Beautiful Girls. Like the debut, a couple fluffy tunes, but it's just Eddie Van Halen's guitar work. He was the kind of the next big guitar hero. Took things to another level, and these guys just were like, the big American thing at the time. And, deservedly, it's on this list. Last one on this pretty lengthy show here. Had to include the Mighty Motorhead here, right? Even though they kind of rose to greater heights in the 80s, it was in the late 70s where they burst on the scene with their kind of mediocre debut, but more importantly, their killer second album, Overkill, my personal favorite by the band. Bomber also came out in the same year. He could have done either one, but I kind of like this one a little bit better. Overkill, Stay Clean, Capricorn, No Class, Damage Case, Metropolis, what a great tune. Tear You Down, Limb from Limb, great songs. Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clark, Filthy Animal Taylor, all gone. Fast Eddie just left us recently, Lemmy and Filthy in the last couple of years, so the classic lineup of Motorhead, they're all gone, folks, but their music lives on. So, a great album to close out the 70s. We might yet do the 80s, but I think before we go there, I want to stick in the 70s for a little bit because I'm going to do the whole underground hard rock and metal album releases. Again, top 25 or so. I think we did 30 here. I'm also going to do, because I'm sure you'll be interested, in my top 20 or 25 prog albums of the 70s. Again, with the same format, I'm not going to repeat bands. So one release from each major band. That's what I'm going to do. And no live albums. Okay, so that's coming up soon. In the meantime, thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for sticking with us on this lengthy episode here. Hope you had fun with this. I kind of enjoyed going through some of these things. But till next time, check us out on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on the Mighty YouTube. We got more rants coming up, more new product showcases and artist retrospectives. I think we got to a Promise in Purple and Sabbath and Triumph. I think a Dio one. Some of you asked for yes. I got lots of stuff I could do. I could do this stuff forever. I should do this full time. Does anybody want to pay me? I would love to do this full time every day. Bring you guys great content. So I love doing it. So anyway, take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.